everyone. Bienvenue à tous à Montréal. We are delighted to welcome you here, which is on the cusp of spring, and especially grateful to UQAM for hosting us in these excellent facilities for the Arctic and Climate Change, the Intersection of Geopolitics and Disinformation Conference. I am Jennifer Irish. I'm the director of the Information Integrity Lab at the University of Ottawa, and I'm the co-host of today's conference, along with the Climate Security Association of Canada, represented here today by Professor Bruno Charbonneau. We find ourselves at an inflection point in Arctic history. The long-standing maxim of the Arctic as high north, low-tension region no longer holds. Canada's Arctic foreign policy increasingly recognizes this shift, with Arctic security and climate resilience now core themes in Canada's defense posture and northern strategy. The political will to act is high, so is the complexity of the threat environment. What does this mean in reality? Well, today's event brings together a stellar lineup of experts across academia, government, defense, and civil society. Over the next half day, we will explore the intersections between climate change, geopolitical competition, and disinformation, focusing especially on how these forces are shaping developments in the Canadian Arctic. Most importantly, hopefully we'll advance actual proposals and strategies for actions. Given the complexity of the challenges faced in this priority region, it is of paramount importance that efforts be guided by common evidence-based assessment of the threats. But information integrity is under fire. The combination of geostrategic conflict and a technological revolution that amplifies influence operations creates ripe conditions for information operations, and these in turn undermine public discourse around climate security in the Arctic and the concerted responses necessary to take on our contemporary threats. It is hoped that this conference will generate a needed multidisciplinary strategy for dealing with the complex challenges of the Arctic, and as a result of the nexus amongst climate change, geostrategic competition, human security challenges, and disinformation and influence campaigns. Let me just say a few words about the Information Integrity Lab. Based at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, the lab is focused on promoting information integrity, and we define that as the accuracy, reliability, and trustworthiness of information content, not just about what's right and wrong, but it includes the identification, analysis, and mitigation of harms caused by disinformation and influence operations. A focus of our work is understanding how climate change narratives are being distorted, whether to undermine scientific consensus, erode public trust, or weaponize environmental issues for geopolitical gain. Our Arctic project is an important component of this wider commitment, and we are pleased that this work is being funded by the Department of National Defense's Mines program, as well as the Trottier Family Foundation. And we hope our results today will provide fodder for a summit on climate change and disinformation that is scheduled for the 19th and 20th of September. Before I proceed further, I'd like to recognize that we are assembled here in the unceded territory of the Kanak Nation. We value the contribution of Indigenous peoples across our land, and I proceed in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. It is now my distinct pleasure to formally open this conference with a warm welcome to Professor Vincent Rigby, my former boss. Many of you already know Mr. Rigby, but allow me to briefly highlight his distinguished career. Mr. Rigby brings extensive experience from senior leadership roles at Global Affairs Canada, Public Safety, and the Department of National Defense. Most notably, he served as the National Security Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2020 to 21. That's when we managed to work together. And he previously chaired the senior Arctic officials during Canada's chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Mr. Rigby now teaches at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy, just down the street. And it's really our honor to have you here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. Greatly appreciate that. And I have to say, when anyone refers to me as professor, I look around and go, who me? I think I'm best quasi-academic. I certainly don't see myself as a fully fledged academic. I'm a retired public servant and one of those officials who've gone on to be a pain in the you-know-what for government by speaking my mind occasionally. And I'll speak my mind a little bit this morning. I hope that's okay. I am not an expert in Arctic misinformation or disinformation. I know a little bit about these topics, having been a national security intelligence advisor during foreign interference activities by China and other countries. So I bear the scars of that experience in 3 appearances before the Hague Commission. So I know a little bit, but in the specific context of the Arctic, perhaps a little less so. And I wouldn't necessarily call myself an Arctic expert either. Did chair the senior Arctic officials during Canada's last chairmanship of the Arctic Council in 2015. And have kept up to speed on the issue, and I've written a little bit about it recently. But I defer to many of you in terms of expertise, in terms of deep knowledge. I know enough just to make myself slightly dangerous. So if I say anything stupid this morning, please call me out, ask me questions, come grab me after the presentation. Happy to have that conversation. But I've got very strong views about the Arctic because I have followed it closely. And I do feel that we are at an inflection point, and I'll talk a little bit about that. A term that I think is often overused, but I think is also appropriate in the case of the Arctic. So I want to put some ideas out on the table for you and get some feedback. I really would like that. So Jennifer's asked me to come in at a bit of a strategic level here and not get into the weeds of misinformation, disinformation, but talk a little bit about Canada and where it stands with respect to the Arctic and perhaps where it needs to go. So that's what I'm going to do. The Arctic is certainly a hot topic. No pun, no irony intended in the context of climate change, but it is a topic that is being discussed, bandied about. Everybody seems to have an opinion. It's been on the front pages of newspapers for the last number of years. And indeed, as I was sitting down to think about what I was going to say today, I was having a hard time thinking what could I say that was new? Because everybody's been speaking out on defense, on national security writ large, economic, social development, how we work with allies. In some respects, it's almost like it's all been said. We know what we have to do. We just have to do it. But I have to say this is a good thing that so many people are speaking out. And there seems to be almost a consensus of views now amongst commentators and even inside government that we need to do something. And so when you have this chorus of voices and a quasi-consensus, maybe not specifically on what we need to do, but we need to do something in the Arctic, that's a good thing. Why have we got this consensus of views right now? Why is it so much in prevalence, this topic? I mean, I don't need to tell you. You're the experts, but I often think that a number of factors have come together. And I wrote an article recently in the latest edition of the Canada Among Nations, which I co-edited with Phil Agasse and Norman Helmer, and I talked about a perfect Arctic storm. And the perfect Arctic storm is climate change and everything that climate change is doing in the Arctic, and you're going to talk about that this morning in terms of melting sea ice and greater economic exploitation as the Arctic is opened up. And climate change has become an enabler for increased geostrategic rivalry in the region. So we see these emerging or continuing or increasing threats from Russia, from China. I won't go into the details about what they're doing. Again, you know all of that. And so those two are mutually reinforcing, I find, and climate change is driving that geostrategic play in the Arctic right now. But then and I'm mixing my metaphors here now from a perfect Arctic storm to baking, but the icing on the cake for me is the United States. So that's the third key factor. And I think for the longest time we've been saying we've got to do more in the Arctic and the North because we need to be a good US ally and we need to help them. Now the context has been changed a little bit, and I think we still want to do that, but we also see the United States, especially I think even after yesterday's discussion between the Prime Minister and the President, as a potential competitor in the Arctic. And when you hear Trump talking about Greenland, when you hear Trump talking about 51st state and looking at the Arctic and its resources and so on, this becomes a concern. So U.S. is now a double-edged sword in the Arctic in a lot of ways. So that's a complexifier for those other two elements in terms of climate change and the geostrategic rivalry. So as I say, this is all bringing together a call for government to do something. And I often think that if we can't do it now, when are we going to do it? Because of this confluence of factors. But then I look back in history and I see, but I talk about history, I don't mean back 10, 20, 30 years since the end of the Cold War, but right back like 100 years. We've always talked, we being the government, we've always talked a good game in the Arctic and the North. And in this same article that I just wrote, I started it off by looking back at what prime ministers have done and said, going back over 100 years. You had Robert Borden just before the First World War sending off explorers to take a look at the Western Arctic and try and develop a bit of not a plan, but to get Canada and the government to start thinking more about what they want to do in the region. You had John Diefenbaker during the 1950s talking about a northern vision and social economic development. You had Mulroney in the 1980s, famously or infamously turning to Ronald Reagan and pointing at the map and saying, "Those icebergs right there, those are our icebergs. Those are Canadian icebergs. Keep your hands off my icebergs." And you had Stephen Harper in the early 2000s saying, "Hey, use it or lose it. We've got to do more." And he did. He did some stuff. I think that was quite useful in terms of using it. The question is this time going to be different? Is this perfect storm, this confluence of factors, going to be enough to get the government to actually move and do something? Now, it's easy to be cynical, especially as a public servant who stepped out of government, and to criticize and say nothing's being done, nothing's being done. I think under the Trudeau government, this stuff was done, and I think that a foundation of sorts was laid. And if you look at the strategies and the policies and some of the investments, particularly on the defense and security side, but also in terms of economic and social development, the Trudeau government did start down the path. You had two defense reviews. You had Strong, Secure and Engaged in 2017, which had an Arctic element to it, and then you had the defense update in 2024, Our North, Strong and Free. And that update, as everyone knows, had a very, very strong focus on the Arctic, and I was very, very pleased by that. And the little influence I have in government anymore, and believe me, it's little. I told people inside D&D, you should really put Arctic front and center, and they did. And I think it's a really good document for that reason. You had the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework in 2019. Which I think is a good document, especially, I think, because of its co-development with Indigenous communities. It's very wide-ranging. It covers a lot of material. I'm still not sure to this day how much it's being funded. I have a hard time following the funding track in terms of how much is actually exclusively devoted to Arctic versus other regions of the country when it comes to housing, when it comes to development, when it comes to even on the security side. And then, of course, you had the Arctic Foreign Policy, which came out at the tail end of last year. And I mean, I'm going to be blunt here. I was disappointed by our Arctic foreign policy. I didn't think there was much in there. A circumpolar ambassador, a couple of consulates in Nuuk, Greenland, and in Anchorage, Alaska. I thought it lacked a bit of vision, and just didn't have much oomph, and didn't seem to have many resources attached to it. And now you've got Prime Minister Carney, and we saw the promises he's made during the campaign and in his Red Book. And so, again, some of it was warmed over Trudeau initiatives, some of it was new, talk about working with the Europeans in terms of Arctic security, recommitment to buying subs, which is a good thing, with under ice capability, lots of talk about dual use infrastructure, deep water ports and so on. So you get the sense from Prime Minister Carney that he's going to take this seriously, if you're to believe what is said in the Red Book. I don't know if they still call it the Red Book, but I used to call it the Red Book when I was growing up. Blue Book, Red Book, Orange Book. So we've got a fresh government with a fresh mandate and a fresh opportunity when it comes to the Arctic. And I find it really interesting right now as we're in the eye of the storm in terms of conversations with the United States and all the talk about what the US is threatening to do to us or is already doing to us, especially with respect to tariffs, that we're hearing more and more and more of this phrase nation building. We're given lemons, let's make a lemonade, but some serious lemonade, not to push the metaphor too far. And so nation building, seizing this opportunity, what the US is doing right now, to grow up as a nation, to be more mature, and to build ourselves at home and internationally. And so you know the list that is being bandied about, breaking down interprovincial trade barriers, getting our natural resources to market, strengthening our borders, revisiting our immigration policies. The list is long. I don't always see Arctic on that list. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But you can't tell me that if you're going to talk about a new nation-building enterprise, a new nation-building initiative in Canada, that you're not going to include the Arctic or the North. To me, it's absolutely fundamental, especially given the context of the Canada-US discussion right now and talk of security and natural resources and geostrategic rivalry and all those good things. So the question is, if we are about to embark on a new nation-building enterprise, is the Arctic going to be part of it? And I would strongly encourage the new government to do that, to move beyond the rhetoric, because I think that under previous governments, under all the prime ministers I've mentioned, and right up to Prime Minister Trudeau, former Prime Minister Trudeau, there was a lot of rhetoric, there was a lot of talk about what we were going to do. There's a famous leaks that came out in the Washington Post a couple of years ago, you may recall, about U.S. perceptions of Canada that came out of their intelligence community, and they specifically referenced the Arctic in one of these briefs that got leaked, that Canada always talks a good game in the Arctic, but they don't step up. It was specifically in the context of NORAD modernization, but more broadly. So are we going to step up? So what would step up mean? Easy for me to say step up, that's rhetorical as well. Step up, Canada. What do we need? So I would recommend the following. You need someone to drive this. And you can say, well, the Prime Minister should drive it. Well, the Prime Minister's kind of a busy guy. Got a lot on his plate these days, as you may have mentioned. But I think one of the problems we've had in the past when it comes to Arctic policy is that we've got a lot of cooks in the kitchen. We've got the Minister of National Defence, we've got CERNA, we've got ISK, we've got Foreign Affairs with Minister Jolie. We'll see if she stays minister. We've got social economic departments. Everybody's got a finger in the pie. You need someone to lead and coordinate this. So I would put out there this idea of not a circumpolar ambassador, but a minister for the Arctic. Now, this would be controversial. A lot of my former colleagues in government would go, you can't do that. Lines of accountability, lines of responsibility. An Arctic minister cannot tell the Minister of National Defence how to spend his or her money, or Jolie, or anybody else. It's not going to work. There would be challenges, without a doubt. But at this point in time, and given what I think is almost a crisis with respect to Arctic, you need a minister in cabinet who is going to be the champion. You need a minister who is going to be the champion publicly, not just within cabinet. You need a minister who's going to herd the cats amongst the other government departments, amongst the other ministers. So would it have challenges? Would it be a little unorthodox? Absolutely. But the Prime Minister can't run the Arctic show. You need someone to push this. What would this minister, or whoever you want to call as lead, do? First and foremost, notwithstanding all those other documents that have come out, and God knows, I criticize the previous government for not being very strategic, and we haven't had a national security strategy in 20 years or a foreign policy in 20 years, but on the Arctic we've had a bunch of strategies. But we don't have something that is fully, in my view, fully comprehensive and integrated. So I would recommend to a new minister of the Arctic, if such a person were to be created or such a role would be created, to come up with a national strategy for Canada for the Arctic, a strategy that is integrated, that is comprehensive, that has a true vision. And if you look at the US national strategy for the Arctic, which came out, I believe, in 2022, that would be a good base or a good foundation. I'll talk a little bit about the pillars in a couple of seconds, and I promise I won't go too much longer. But you need to take those piecemeal strategies, and even some would argue, well, the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework wasn't piecemeal, it was pretty comprehensive, but it's now 6 years old and it's under a previous government. If the new government wants to put a stamp on the Arctic and make it part of this nation building exercise, here's your national strategy. This is what we're aiming to do. This is the vision that we've been talking about for over 100 years, and this is how we're going to do it. And with that strategy comes money, and you state at the beginning, this is what we're going to spend on the Arctic. The Indo-Pacific strategy came out a couple of years ago, and they were right up front, $2.5 billion over 5 years, and this is explicitly how we're going to spend it, and they laid it all out. That's what we need for an Arctic strategy. And then we need to move fast. And one of the problems, I think, with the previous government is that there was a bit of, I use the D&D term, fire and forget. Make an announcement and then move on. That's why you need a dedicated minister to implement, and implement quickly. One of the other complaints from the Americans is often, not only do we talk a good game, but we say we're going to do stuff, but we never actually follow through quickly. We get to it eventually, but we don't do it quickly, nor at modernization, so have somebody drive this. I like the U.S. strategy, and they've since come out with a defense strategy to support the national strategy. But there are 4 pillars, and I think for Canada, you fundamentally need 4 pillars as well, or a variation on those 4 pillars. The U.S. national strategy starts with security, which is interesting. And I always say the U.S. looks at everything through a national security lens at the end of the day. And I think we need to look more through a national security lens. But in the case of the Arctic, I would actually start with social and economic development. National security equals human security. And I know this has become a cliche and we all talk about it, but I'm not sure we take it as seriously as we should. So make that linkage between human security and national security, and you've got to work on all those issues that we've been talking about forever in terms of education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, all that stuff, and all the initiatives that we've been talking about or even starting to implement, pull them all together into a comprehensive economic, social plan to move ahead. And only if we do that, at the end of the day, are we ever going to have true security in the North, if we take care of our Indigenous peoples and we take care of everybody in the North in terms of their social, economic well-being. It has to start there. I then would come to security. But let's please take security away exclusively from the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm tired of everyone, when it comes to talking about security in the North, goes, well, yeah, the Canadian Armed Forces have to step up the game. We need to do more on the defense side. Yeah, we absolutely have to do more on the defense side. We've got a very, very small military presence in the Arctic. But at the end of the day, the CAF aren't going to do it on their own. And all the bases you want to build, including potentially with the Americans, and all the deep water ports and all the infrastructure we build, if we don't have other government departments up there doing their share, it's not going to work. I'm sure you're all aware of the Auditor General report from a few years ago, where they laid out all the weaknesses and flaws with respect to the Coast Guard, with respect to our surveillance capability in the Arctic, including through RadarSat. There are so many weak links there. And you need those departments and agencies, the RCMP and others, working with the CAF, using the same infrastructure to provide that security piece, so it's got to be broad. I think another element needs to be, or another pillar needs to be, climate change. And I won't go into any details because I'm not a climate change expert in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but it needs to be there as a pillar because, again, it's going to complement the other elements. And then finally, we need to talk in detail about what we're going to do internationally. And I think what's changed even from the December, I think, release of our Arctic foreign policy is that the US is now in a different basket. And so that foreign policy update is almost out of date. So how are we going to work with the US? Are they a competitor? Or are they actually going to be someone we're going to cooperate with? Are we going to do both? Probably a mix. How are we going to work with NATO? What are we going to do with the Nordic states? I know that, again, as part of the Liberal campaign, Prime Minister Carney talked about working with the Europeans, specifically in the Arctic. How are we going to do that? And how are we going to deal with our adversaries? And again, there's some good stuff that's already been done. ICE and with the icebreakers, we've done some good stuff with respect to the Arctic Council. But what disappointed me with the foreign policy that was recently released was that the Arctic Council, it was discussed as something that Canada needs to focus on, but how are you going to revive the Arctic Council? Wither the Arctic Council? I just didn't get an answer there, and I think Canada can play a leadership role in that regard. We were front and center in the creation of the Arctic Council. We could step up now and potentially really make a difference because we have expertise in doing these sorts of things on a multilateral basis. Produce it fast, okay? Don't take years to consult. I know there'll be questions about whether this should be co-developed or not. I think it would be a good idea, a smart idea to co-develop this, but I think it needs to move fast, allocate the resources, as I say, and make it a priority. And I think it's going to have 3 messages at the end of the day and 3 target audiences. It's going to show to Canadians that we care about the Arctic and we're actually going to do something this time, and that we're going to assert our sovereignty and promote economic and social development in that region. I think it's incredibly important to do that and to show Canadians. Second, it's going to show to our potential adversaries, take away the potential, our adversaries in the region, Russia, China, that we mean business. And third, and perhaps most importantly given the current context, show to our allies, and in particular the United States, that we are going to make a move in this region and going to do what we have to do. There's an old phrase in the defense world. It's often been used in trying to describe Canadian defense policy, defense against help. We do defense because we don't want, or we do defense up to a certain level, just usually barely that level, to make sure that the US doesn't step in and do it for us, and US stepping in and helping us, but when they help us, they actually fill a vacuum. So this might be another variation on Mulroney telling Reagan, keep your hands off our icebergs. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Vince. You never disappoint as a fellow pracademic, not only providing a very insightful assessment of the different tensions at play, also coming out with some very bold proposals, and I hope we can continue to build on those during the course of the day. I know there's a desire to engage in Q&A, and we also have a large number of persons who are participating online, ranging from the Yukon to Europe. It's great that we have a very large group here. But before we do that, I want to just continue with the scene setter, going a little bit deeper, especially on the climate change elements, by inviting 2 more speakers to come up. So I invite Professor Bruno Charbonneau, my co-host, and also Professor Jackie Dawson from University of Ottawa, a colleague there. I do also just want to mention the full set of bios of all of our speakers have been circulated to your tables, and we have an incredible number of speakers with incredible CVs and bios. We're not going to go through those bios in details as we present the speakers, but we do invite you to refer to them. So first of all, let me just do little introduction. So Bruno Charbonneau is the Professor of International Studies at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean, Senior Scientific Advisor to NATO, and also the founding President of the Climate Security Association of Canada, with whom we co-host this conference. And Jackie Dawson, equal number of large titles, but she's here largely as in the capacity of being the director of a new Arctic research hub that has just been created at the University of Ottawa. She's also not only a full professor, but a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Human Policy Dimensions of Environmental Change at the University of Ottawa in its Department of Geography. So I'm going to ask Bruno first for you to share some of the key takeaways from the conference on climate security that has taken place 2 days before we started here, and also some of the trends and pivots that have been taking place amongst the great powers, including the US, building on Vincent Rigby's presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Vincent and Jackie. It's very interesting. I'm looking forward to conversation, discussion, especially about the 4 pillars. I like that. Action is certainly warranted. So yes, on climate change and security, where to start and do it in only 3 minutes after 2 days of discussion and years also of work and stuff is always a bit difficult. But 2 things. I want to emphasize that when we talk about climate change and security, it's a sort of emerging, I still think of it as an emerging field of practice, both in academia and policy world. So still kind of trying to figure out what it is about and what we should do about it, again, both in academic terms and policy terms. But I think coming out of the last 2 days, coming out also, and some in the room have contributed to a report that I'm leading for NATO, so a research task group on the consequences of climate change on security, where we have different case studies, 3 regional, in particular the Arctic, Eastern Europe, where we focused around in the Ukraine region, and one on northwestern Africa. And one thing that comes out of that, and one thing that comes out of all of discussions like the past 2 days, is that context is very key to understanding the security consequences of climate change. What do I mean by that? I mean that discussing what climate change means for particular political, military, security, economic, social dynamics depend on the context within which you talk about those consequences. And on the Arctic in particular, and I'm not an Arctic expert, but our discussion, Pauline and Marisol will talk about that, but Pauline was involved in that chapter. One thing that I think we emphasize and underline is that there are different Arctics, and they're different, very much perspective of what the Arctic means. And for one big contrast that I thought is important to understand, especially in the NATO context, is that the European position on the Arctic is very different than the Canadian. And Vincent, I appreciate that you emphasize the sort of human security aspect, but that's certainly something we emphasize in the Canadian case compared to our Nordic European allies, who instead like to focus on what it means for Russian military power and influence in the region and whatnot. Because I think, and climate scientists could contradict me, we have a few in the room, but the Canadian Arctic, even in the short, medium term, will remain mostly frozen compared to this sort of Russian space where the naval I guess the seaways will open up, and already open up quite drastically. And the other thing about context is the relationship with or the analytical difficulty in articulating the particular local context with the global. And we had that discussion on the first day, among other things. How do we talk about global climate change and global climate diplomacy and geopolitics, and how does that filter in or being inserted in particular context? And that's something I'll come back to. The second point that came out, and maybe that's my bias, because that was one of the points I made over the last 2 days, is where are we at in terms of the climate change urgency? Is there still an emergency? Where's this the feeling of urgency given what's going on in the world right now? Climate change, we're certainly not like in 2020 or 2021. Seems that climate change is there to stay. People talk about it. We are here. It is an example, but there is limited sense of urgency, it seems to me. And there are a lot of ambiguous signs about where this thing, climate change and global diplomacy on climate change is going. Just a few things like in terms of GHG emission, greenhouse gases emission, still rising up. We also have governments, including Canadian government, UK government, Mexican government, that are now promising to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure. Not a good sign for those of us who are concerned with climate change. We have, of course, now a U.S. administration that's trashing everything that's more or less related to something green or woke or climate or whatever. That's not a good sign either. But there are other signs like the energy transition. I mean, if you look at the curves, they're going up, they're going exponential. So in 2024, 90% of the added energy, global energy, was from renewable. The investment in renewable energy also have tripled in the last 3 years, up to 2 trillion recently. But that sort of positive sign or positive signs come mostly from China, which is another issue that maybe we should insert into our conversation about global politics of climate change, including security issues. I'll come back to that. So those would be my two things about climate change. Now, where does the U.S. fit into that picture? And then the Arctic, yeah, we had that discussion too over the last 2 days. I think, again, the obvious thing is, like I said, the U.S. administration calling climate change things like it's woke, it's crap, dismantling all sorts of things. Despite that, the work keeps going in other places, whether it's at NATO or Canada or elsewhere here in this room. But we've got to be careful, perhaps, where you talk about climate change and security. But there are also, we talked about the Europeans, for instance, who gave a cold shoulders to the American delegation at an energy conference a week or two ago, when the Americans were saying you need to invest in oil and gas and buy oil and gas, and the Europeans said, well, maybe not. We're still going into going to invest in the energy transition. We might have to buy from China in the short term, but we'll build up a capacity and so on and so forth. So. And the other thing I think to underline here, in terms, obviously, the obvious reaction to what's going on in the U.S. is, of course, I think it's been referred to already, the promises of investing in defense. And that's where there are, let's say, all sorts of elements of debates to be had. Because as some of our interlocutors over the last 2 days have said, thinking about defense without now considering climate change means locking in future emissions, among other things. So if you're thinking about building new weapon platforms like fighter jets or navies that run on fossil fuel, that means decades and decades of future emission that are locked into the system. And as we've seen and discussed, military emissions are becoming a bigger part of the picture. So yes, the military, the Canadian forces and others have to respond to the consequences of climate change, but they are potentially also an increasing part of the problem, and that needs to be considered. And obviously that's a big issue there, and there's a big problem because sometimes the technological solution is not even there, but there is a consideration to be had. And maybe just to conclude, to be a bit more perhaps specific about the Arctic, with all sort of caveats about me not being the Arctic expert per se, but seems to me that in Canada, when we talk about climate change security, we think about the Arctic only. So that's one thing I would say. I think we need to expand that conversation beyond the Arctic and figure out what it means to integrate the Arctic and the rest of Canada into that conversation. Vincent, I very much approve everything you've said. I would just ask you, how does that indeed or should be inserted or integrated with this general discussion about what should be our foreign policy and our security and defense policy into the future, right? So how does that do these pieces fit together? And then I suspect that the key issues will indeed be our relationship with the U.S. right now. I personally think that in Canada we overstate the security risk in the Arctic. The threat of Russia or Chinese somehow invading the Arctic or threatening our sovereignty, I think with multiple grains, a lot of grain of salt. But our relationship in the Arctic, I think, goes through our relationship, our policy in the Arctic goes through our relationship with the Americans, especially in the Alaska space. I was there and encouraged, and we talked about that. So search and rescue, for instance, cooperation, indigenous communities, and so on and so forth, support, what sort of capabilities can you share, and more. I'm sure the expert will tell us, but I think if we're talking about Canadian Arctic policy, it's very much about our relationship with the U.S. first and foremost. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Bruno, for that and for helping to set the context. Now I'm going to turn to Jackie Dawson, invite you to set the scene more in terms of both climate change and the human security challenges, including, specifically also factoring the vulnerability of Indigenous peoples in the North, and how that adds, an extra layer of concern to an already delicate region.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I really appreciated your comments. Thank you, Jennifer, for the invitation, and yeah, Vincent and Bruno, I couldn't agree more with this. I'm so excited that we're finally really focusing on the Arctic. I've been thinking about the Arctic since I was about 12, when I got obsessed with Franklin and Shackleton. I mean, he was in the Antarctic, but and then going there. But what's really the most beautiful thing about our Arctic is the culture and the people and the landscape. And it couldn't be more true that the Canadian Arctic is very different than other Arctic regions. And I know we love to throw out this line, the Arctic is unique, but it really is. And we, even in the South, we hear this in the election campaign, well, the BC's unique, Alberta's unique, Saskatchewan's unique, we're all unique, and we all know that. But the Arctic is really unique in our country. And it is our front yard, it is not our backyard, and we need to be thinking that way. It's 40% of our landmass, and depending on how you do the math, it's between 70 and 87% of our coastline. 87% if you include all the islands, and you go around. But I like to throw that out. So this is a huge part of our country, and most of us haven't been, don't think about it. So to start, I'm curious, how many people in the room have physically been to the Arctic?
Does Alice count?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, a few, which is great, and you'd expect that in a room like this. But still, we're all here to talk about the Arctic, and not all of us have been there. It's a very expensive place to get to. I was speaking with Daniel in the cab ride over here this morning. It's about $3,000 to $4,000 just to get to Iqaluit, let alone Resolute, which is about $6,000 just in flights. So no wonder most of us aren't there. Why? Because the infrastructure is horrendous. We don't have modern day infrastructure to support development. And yesterday, when Carney was visiting Trump, we all heard about that. In his first interjection, he referenced the Arctic, and he said, "We are in agreement with you, President Trump, in securing and developing the Arctic." So I hope that's an indication that we're serious about that. And developing the Arctic, I think it's really exciting, because in some ways we have a blank, beautiful canvas, and we can learn from all of the mistakes that have been made in other places and do this in the right way. And the right way is through co-development. And that's going to take time, and I agree it needs to be done quickly. But we got to the moon quickly together. When we set our mind to it, we can do it. So I really encourage us all to set our mind to it. So I really appreciated your comments, Vincent. So to climate change, I want to paint a picture. We do a lot of modeling, both climatic modeling and socioeconomic modeling, looking into the future. So I want to talk a little bit about the impacts that we see from climate change, impacts being things we've already observed, they're already happening, and the risks. The risks are what we are projecting into the future. And of course, then there's these compounding and cascading effects of these changes. And so I think most of us understand that as a country and as the world, we are all agreed that we're trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So that's the Paris Agreement. We are now looking at 2.7. And that number comes when you look at the nationally determined contributions of every country in the world, and you calculate where we're going to be at 2.7. So that's so now I'm encouraging all of us science types, and I don't know how many of us academics are in the room, but we need to start modeling at 2.7 degrees, not 1.5. And that will help us understand what future we are actually looking at. We're reluctant to say that because we don't want to get people to think we're doomed, we're done, let's not bother. We've known this for a little while, but now we need to say it because we need to bend that curve back, and we need to get back to 1.5, and we need to do it as quickly as we can. So what does 2.7 mean for the Arctic? Well, the Arctic is warming now at almost four times the rate of the global average. Used to be 2 times, and we thought that was shocking. It's now 4 times, so we're talking about double-digit warming in the Arctic. That's a rapid transformation. So by the end of this century, there's many different projections, and I want to give you just a few. We expect that the permafrost area to go from about 15 million square kilometers to about 8 million square kilometers, so 50% loss. We think that it's possible that the top 3 layers, 3 meters of permafrost will be gone. That will cause an enormous amount of infrastructure damage in the billions to trillions of dollars when you're looking at the global Arctic. It also will create some technological and engineering challenges that we need, military support and private sector support to get through. We expect that we will lose the western Hudson Bay polar bear population, among other species, and that has major food security issues. We're talking about an ice-dependent ecosystem, and Inuit, who have 4 settled land claim areas in the Arctic, which is fantastic, a fantastic base for Canada, rely heavily on ice-dependent and other marine mammals for subsistence and diet. And so when we lose that ice ecosystem, there's a major implications for Inuit culture and communities. In terms of sea ice, we're seeing record losses. So over 50% loss in sea ice in summertime over the last 2 decades. And we think that all the sea ice will be more or less gone in summertime by 2050 for sure. There's some people that think it'll happen by 2030. I'm not so sure. And that means the Northwest Passage will open, we think, by about a month. So the season of the Northwest Passage will increase by about a month. And to your point earlier, Bruno, the Northeast Passage, so the Russian side, that's already open much longer than that. And we think that by the same time period, that passage will increase about 100 days. So that is the main sort of Arctic economic maritime trade corridor. But of course, because of political dynamics, there's less interest in using the passage along Russia. There's more interested in using the transpolar route across the top or the Northwest Passage. Now, why is it that we aren't seeing opening of the Northwest Passage? Well, the reason is that all of the ice in the Arctic Ocean is breaking up, and it's actually, because of the currents, the wind and everything, it's flowing directly into the Northwest Passage. So it's actually mobile multi-year ice that's in the Northwest Passage. We are seeing statistically significant reductions in ice in the Northwest Passage. It's just being replaced with other ice. So that's why it's gonna be longer before that passage is open. That creates challenges for economic development, which we want to see. We want to see infrastructure, multi-use infrastructure, et cetera, because the people in the region need that, and because, for many reasons. There is about 50% food insecurity across the Arctic. So I don't know if any of you have gone in to try to buy food in the northern or the co-op. Depending on the time of year, a can of Coke is $6. Green pepper can be $14. A watermelon can be, or actually, I'll give you a good one, a pumpkin at Halloween can be upwards of $80. We are shipping things into these remote communities. So food security is one of the #1 concerns as the climate is changing, where people have less access to country food and they continue to have expensive food sources. I think the last thing I just want to talk about in terms of security and climate change and people, or there's a couple points I want to make, is around the Northwest Passage. And that is that even though the ice may not be gone, and it may be riskier to go through there may be economic and other geopolitical reasons that area will be used. So technological developments in ship design, cleaner and more cheaper fuels. At some point we will see activity through there, and it will have major impacts for communities that live there. And I think I'll end there because I think there's room for Q&As, but I just want to really highlight that there are many, many people living in the Arctic. It's their homeland, and they have to be part of whatever decisions we make going forward.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jackie. That was a tremendous, good evidence-based review of some of the challenges, including on the human security side. I do want to start this dialogue with a couple of questions of my own. For one, all three of you have emphasized the multi-dimensional and layered concerns in the Arctic. And one of you could talk to the extent to which Indigenous peoples, the scientific community, governments, security community are actually working together on an evidence-based understanding of these challenges, and how can that be reinforced? Because it's one thing to have like a grand strategy, and certainly yours is compelling, Vince, but it requires sinew amongst these disparate actors, which isn't apparent that that's coming together. So I wonder if you could speak to that as an opener.
I can't talk to the specifics of the Arctic, but very briefly, I would simply say that I've had that conversation with people in the room about what does it mean for government, what is government governance under climate change conditions, and who owns a climate file. I mean, that's a big issue, and I think probably for most government, but certainly in Ottawa, and then the relationship with provinces, we can have that sort of discussion about the Arctic, but I'd say in terms of responses to natural disaster, whether it's forest fires or floods or whatnot. Personally, I think climate change transforms everything, like it impacts everything we do, every sector of human activity. It's not everything, it's not the one issue to deal with, but it does transform, and you should, I think, consider climate change effects, like you put it very well about the Arctic. What does it mean to do? I would ask you, what kind of development do you have in mind, given what we know what's coming? Because we have an understanding what development is, and I've had those discussions where my expertise is in West Africa, development being a sort of industrial mindset, fossil fuel based, so international development aid comes in, and they have this sort of model that they're supposed to rebuild Europe in West Africa. Well, in this context, it's not working. It shouldn't either be based on fossil fuel. So I would put that question to you as well. And I don't necessarily have the answer. Like, who should own the climate file in Ottawa, or should it be something that's spread out through all the ministries, every sector, again, of the government, and what does that actually mean? Then we're back to who owns the expertise, because it's really complicated. We need people who know government, who know organization, who know policy. We also need all sorts of climate science engineers and whatnot. It's such a big challenge.
Jackie?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I really appreciated the suggestion of an Arctic minister. When that might be, I understand also the challenge. I was the scientific director of ArcticNet for 7 years, and when we were trying to renew it, I was going, minister to minister to minister, talking about the Arctic, and it was always, well, that's, you should talk to Champagne, you should talk to Jolie, you should talk to, so it needs ownership for sure. So that's one point. I wanted to say that Canada's the only Arctic nation without an Arctic science strategy. Every single other Arctic nation has an Arctic science strategy, and non-Arctic nations have Arctic science strategies. And actually, if I can, there's a Hill Times article that I wrote about this that came out today. And I really think we need an Arctic science strategy. China has an Arctic science strategy, et cetera. Science can be diplomacy. We've got scientists floating around on icebreakers, on industrial vessels, on cruise ships all the time. Science can play a role in diplomacy. And also, some of these security intrusions come in through science. I think we all know that. We've seen that in different places, more recently in the Biological 3 lab, or I don't know much about it, but we have to work together. And how we do that, we need to change our mindset. We need to stop owning files and being turfy about files and focus areas, and we need to to work together. And that's academia and government. We don't do that very well together. We need to get through that. And maybe having an Arctic minister with a very clear mandate, maybe one of those bullets can be forcing us to work together, because what we're doing right now is not working. And we even have an ADM science committee and a DG science, Arctic science committee, and we still can't do it. So
I don't have a lot to add. I would simply say that in my call for a comprehensive strategy, focusing the mind of government and led by an Arctic ambassador potentially, I don't want that to sound like this is whole of government, and which is a good thing. It does need to be whole of government, but it needs to be the whole of Canada. And you might say, well, whole of Arctic, but it needs to be Canada, because so many even provinces bump up against the Arctic as well, including Quebec and others. So this has got to be a whole of Canada enterprise, because as you say, the Arctic makes up 40% of our land mass, whatever the statistic is. I hadn't heard that 87% before, so that's pretty cool. I like that. This is such a big part of our country, we've got to be engaged. And you've heard the territorial premiers, I find, speaking out more and more in the last couple of years, especially on the security file. Like, come on, Ottawa, get with it, get engaged. We need to talk about this, because we're feeling these security threats in the region. So talk to us. Now, in a practical sense, I think that the government is starting to do a little bit better. And if you look at some of the hybrid threats that you're going to be talking about this morning, including misinformation, disinformation, intrusions into the economic space, the Chinese trying to get hold of certain economic enterprises, and all kinds of stuff that's been blocked through the Investment in Canada Act and national security provisions. I mean, I think you are seeing the government reaching out a little bit more to people on the ground. I know for a fact CSIS, and they've been very public about this, is going out and talking to Indigenous peoples, talking to citizens of the North, and saying, listen, these are the threats. And it's so important that government be transparent about the threats, talk about them. And I know that'll be a core element of the misinformation, disinformation. Government's got to take a lead. And so, I've been a big proponent. When I was National Security Advisor, I pushed this as well. Transparency, openness on intelligence and what we know about the threats. Talk about the threats. You can't counter misinformation and disinformation. You can't counter any kind of security threat if the residents of the community don't know what the threats are and they're not told what the threats are. And so, CSIS has had its legislation amended so that it can be more open now in terms of what they share, in terms of sharing more classified information. And so hopefully that's a trend that we'll see in the Arctic as well.
And I just want to probe that a little bit further and maybe have an international context to our scene setter discussion here. I mean, certainly what we're seeing at the Information Integrity Lab is active influence and information operations from hostile state actors, including Russia, but also China. I recently did a mission to Finland, Sweden, and Latvia, and certainly coming back from that, you get a heightened sense that we are actually in the throes of a hybrid warfare, or at least gray zone conflict. And when you look at sabotage operations on top, including undersea cables, there's a completely different sense of the threat than what we have in Canada. And just like your comments on that, to what extent do you think that we are in that state of already a nascent conflict, and how does that change, the dynamic and what we need to do? In part to set the stage for a deeper dive discussion on disinformation influence campaigns, which we've seen both counteract the science and understanding of what is the science of climate change, but also it's targeting Indigenous people in a place also where there is already a rather weak information ecosystem. So that gives a number of threads to pull on. I don't know if Vincent.
Well, I can kick it off and just say I agree with you. It's not just happening in the Arctic, right? I mean, there's hybrid warfare across the full range of activities of Russia, China, in different regions as well. And I think we've all been reading in open sources what the Russians have been up to in the wake of Ukraine, all kinds of nasty stuff. in Europe in particular, but other parts of the world too, and potentially even with Canada, and including in the Arctic. So I wouldn't say this is just an Arctic issue in terms of hybrid warfare, hybrid activities. We've already mentioned some of the issues on information, disinformation, economic security, undersea cables that are being discovered. It's there. It's absolutely there. It's not something for the future. It's right now. And the Russians, I think, are particularly aggressive. And there's been a lot written about their campaign of hybrid warfare and some nasty stuff throughout the world. But I think that the Arctic, in the context of this discussion, deserves special attention. It really does.
Bruno?
I like to bring up uncomfortable problems or issues, and when it comes to China, for instance, without folks, I cannot talk about the disinformation space, but from a climate change perspective, it presents a very interesting and challenging policy issue and political issue. China, to me, I very much agree with the argument that the future of climate change and climate global policy is Asian and mostly Chinese. Why? Because, well, 30% of the emissions are Chinese now, or about 29%. Asia is where most people on Earth live, like over half the population of the Earth almost is Asian or in Asia. So that's where things are happening. The solutions are also very much coming from China right now. Solar energy and technology. Chinese own probably 90%. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but something like 80–90% of the solar panel market. They are very much advanced in battery technology as well. They're making headways there. Their electric vehicle tech and industry is making headways and probably will conquer the rest of the planet unless I don't know if we'll open it up here in Canada and US, but so a lot of solutions, both the problems and solutions, come from China from a climate perspective. And if we talk again to the question of development and trade, what do you do when you have cheap solar panel and very much advanced battery technology being made in China? I mean, I'll just give one example. We have a few European colleagues here. The Europeans now are saying, let's do the sort of Chinese play. Let's bring the Chinese electric vehicle and technology in Europe, and then we'll copy it and sort of try to get into that market as well. And obviously that everything I'm saying here is in the context of these tensions, right? The geopolitical tensions, political, military, and whatnot. And the U.S. obviously being a big player in that Chinese sort of U.S.-Chinese tension and rivalry. And again, in the context of Canada, when we sort of followed the U.S. leadership when it came to China, and our relationship with China is so-so, let's put it that way. What are we going to do next? I don't know, but I think it's sort of inevitable that we need a sort of Chinese policy if we want to talk about climate change. And can you open doors for cooperation, collaboration in science terms, for instance, but also in economic terms? I think if you take that sort of mid to long-term perspective on climate change, sort of inevitable that unless you want to be left behind, like perhaps in Washington, sorry, that's my editorial comment, you kind of have to get involved in that game. But anyway, sorry.
Jackie, you get the last word.
Well, that is an honor. Thank you. I am not a security expert. I think about the Arctic a lot, but I have a few thoughts around development and trade. So 90% of trade is done by ship, almost 90. And it's the greenest form of transport, shipping. Right now, until we develop some sort of other technologies that we see in space, what is that, Star Trek and things. And so there is going to be interest in the Arctic for trade development and also for mineral resources. So I think it all comes down to value, the value of the Arctic. So these geopolitical challenges and security, and tell me if I'm wrong because I'm not a security expert, but they're largely accentuated by value, money. And so we know there's cobalt in the Arctic. Now that we've moved into this world of AI, we need different types of precious minerals that we can find in the Arctic. So even though, we have oil and gas and other things and diamonds and gold and things, we also have important precious minerals that are part of our new world. And so I do think we are going to have to work with the global community. And to do that, we need to we need to work with Arctic nations. So there's a lot of tension right now, and it's definitely the science space, and I assume it's in other spaces as well, where non-Arctic nations are trying to lead in this Arctic space, and there are a lot of opinions on that. But as a Canadian, as Canada, as an Arctic nation, we need to play a leadership role. And we need to play that leadership role looking at the Arctic as our front yard and then looking at our allies internationally, I think. And we have settled land claim areas in our Arctic. That is not something that other Arctic nations with indigenous populations have. We need to use that to our advantage. Those are legal entities that we can use. So we have to work. There are some incredible Inuit and Indigenous leaders. You mentioned the premiers, PJ, among others, Nathan Obed, among others. Incredible leaders. And they need to be at the table, at the highest tables, discussing these things to move forward. And one other point I want to make to the international aspect is it's all connected. So we're seeing droughts around the Panama Canal. There's military conflicts around the Suez Canal, or it might be reversed. That's going to also force traffic to the Arctic. So those are those compounding factors. We can't just go, the ice is going to block up the Northwest Passage, and especially the northern route, which we really like, so we're probably fine. No, actually we're not, because there's a global, internationally connected aspect, and so we have to engage. The globally connected problems require globally connected solutions, but we need leadership in our country to do that.
Can I ask a technical question I've always wanted to ask? Because the floating ice, because this is the great irony, right? That it's supposedly the melting ice is opening up the Arctic, but now you've got pieces of ice that are floating around. Is that a short-term problem, or is that a medium, long-term problem? How is that going to play out?
Yeah, that's a medium, long-term problem. Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's because of that, the ice pack in the Arctic Ocean. And unless we see major changes, which eventually we will, we're going to see the increasingly mobile ice coming in and choking up the Northwest Passage and then flowing out. So, yeah.
Just a quick question to you, Jackie, because you brought up mining. I forgot to say that China also has a monopoly in a lot of rare mineral material for all those technologies for alternative energy sources and anyway, all that. The alternative to that is opening up very dirty mines.
Yes.
So you bring up our resources, but are we socially, politically, say, ready, or do we accept that we might do that? What's the opinion, or do you have a feeling what's going on with public opinion in the Arctic or whatnot? And we know that these projects anyway take decades to develop and open up and whatnot, but in terms of social and environmental impact of those mines, It's
complicated. I mean, we know, but we have to remember there's a population in the Arctic that have the right to develop their land and their space in the way that they see fit. So in some ways, I do not feel qualified to answer that question at all. But I can't imagine a world where we don't continue some form of mining. But I mean, I'm not.
And we're seeing a lot of influence operations around that very issue, especially on the part of China. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for this scene setter. I think going forward in the next two panels. We'll make sure that there's more interaction and opportunities from the floor for comments. But please join me in thanking so much our speakers from the introductory session.